A decade, Megyn Kelly was a fixture here at Fox. In early 2017, she moved to NBC, where, among many other things, she anchored the third hour of the Today Show. It turned out to be a very turbulent year for NBC. NBC executives were caught covering up for accused sex criminal Harvey Weinstein. Meanwhile, the network's most famous anchor, Matt Lauer, fled the building after he was implicated in a laundry list of misdeeds. An awful lot of drama for one network. Megyn Kelly was right there to see all of it. She left her show last October. She's not done a single televised interview since. We're happy to have her on our set tonight. Megyn Kelly joins us now. Megyn, good to see you.
Hi, good to be with you.
So this Ronan Farrow book adds details to what we essentially knew, which is that NBC executives and the elect, particularly Noah Oppenheim, I think the head of NBC News, covered up for Harvey Weinstein. So here's what Ronan Farrow's book says, and I want your reaction to this quote. Farrow brings a recording made by the NYPD to NBC, and in it, Harvey Weinstein admits that he abused an Italian model. On tape, Noah Oppenheim, head of the news division, responds this way, quote, "My view is that the tape and Harvey Weinstein grabbing a lady's breasts a couple of years ago, that's not national news." Does that surprise you, having worked there?
You know, nothing surprises me anymore, Tucker, in this industry. As I've watched the Ronan story unfold as his book has come out, Ronan Farrow, Catch and Kill, the number one thing I've wanted to know is, what did they know and when did they know it?
Right.
Because I've been reporting on this story even while I was at NBC. I talked to Ronan, I talked to his producer, Rich McHugh, I talked to Rose McGowan, I talked to many Harvey Weinstein victims and accusers, and was getting to the bottom of what NBC knew while I was there, and then just independently. And the question is, what did they know about Matt Lauer prior to the time the woman came forward who was ultimately his downfall? She came forward, her name is Brooke Nevels, made an allegation against Matt Lauer, and the company's whole defense to Ronan's book essentially has been, that's the first we ever knew about Matt Lauer. There was no deal between us and Harvey Weinstein to cover up for Harvey Weinstein so that he wouldn't report on Matt Lauer, because we didn't even know that Matt Lauer was doing this. We had no notice of it whatsoever.
Is that a plausible claim?
If they had no settlements of any kind and no complaints about Matt Lauer prior to Brooke Nevels coming forward, sure, it might be. But is that true? Here's what they're saying. No settlements of any kind. No settlement. Well, that's a legal sleight of hand. You can get paid out as a sexual harassment victim in something other than a settlement. You can get what's called enhanced severance. That's the situation where the receptionist is suddenly getting a 7-figure goodbye. She was like an amazing typist, did so well, right? And it's just severance. It's not a settlement. It's just like, hey, and by the way, if you could just be really quiet about NBC forevermore, we'd really appreciate it. That's what we need to know. They haven't gotten specific about what monies were paid out to whom. Show us the money. The number one thing that needs to happen now is they need to release any and all Matt Lauer accusers from their confidentiality agreements. NBC says it has nothing to hide. Great. Let's not hide anything. Show us all of the agreements, the enhanced severance agreements that were reached, or at least the numbers, so we can see which ones pop out, which ones are super high, and are they all women, and do they all have a connection with Matt Lauer? And number two, release the women from their confidentiality obligations. So
this probably would be known right now if the network had conducted an independent investigation. Last September, early September, you on your show on the air on NBC called for an independent investigation into these allegations. I think we have the tape of you doing this.
But there is a question about whether there should be an outside investigator to take a hard look at this. You know, between the investigation NBC did internally on Matt Lauer to now this, you know, there's the question of the faith and confidence of the public in the reporting of NBC on matters involving itself. And it's, to me, as a lawyer, it's just always better if you just send it outside, and then people can have more faith in it. And if there's nothing to hide, you have no worries about it. You know, you have nothing to worry about.
So people's jaws hung open when you said that. There have been a couple of published accounts that say you were fired from NBC a little more than a month later for saying that. With that in mind, without even having you comment on it, I want to get your response to something that an anchor at MSNBC did 2 nights ago. Chris Hayes addressed the credibility of the president of NBC News directly on his show. He said this.
Oppenheim and others have also maintained since Farrow's departure 2 years ago, the Weinstein story was never broadcast because it lacks sufficient on-the-record sourcing, even after NBC supported Farrow's assignment for 7 months. One thing, though, is indisputable. Ronan Farrow walked out of NBC News after working on the Weinstein story and within 2 months published an incredible article, The New Yorker. The path of least resistance is always there, beckoning seductively with an entirely plausible cover story. You've got bigger fish to fry. This isn't the hill to die on. The story isn't ready. But of course, it's the very ease of that path that makes it the enemy, the kind of work that we as journalists are supposed to do.
He's saying essentially what you said, which is he doesn't trust the management at NBC News. Given your experience, do you think he's in jeopardy of being fired?
No comment on that. But I will say the question is open as to whether they put dollars ahead of decency, about whether they were more interested in protecting their star anchor than they were in protecting the women of the company. There needs to be an outside investigation into this company. They investigated themselves. That doesn't work. No. Fox News had an outside investigator. CBS News had an outside investigator. NPR, the NFL. This is how it's done. You get somebody on the outside who can be trusted. What happened here is you've got Noah Oppenheim, who now they're pulling his college writings where he said women love to be preyed on. Apparently he thinks women love to be preyed upon. Okay, now Noah has said, I deeply regret that, and I'm sorry for what I wrote in college. And people do write dumb-ass things in college and say dumb things, trust me. But that's the person who's investigating himself. Andy Lack. The reporting that Ronan has put out is that there is an accuser, or a woman named Jane Wallace, who said she was bullied out of her job when working for Andy years ago. She had a consensual affair with him, but then she says she was retaliated against. And she says he relentlessly preyed on female underlings. If these are the people overseeing the investigation into NBC, right? They had Kim Harris, the general counsel, do the investigation. How are people supposed to trust it? That's why you've got to get somebody on the outside.
Of course, but it's also there's this striking irony. So even as the management of NBC clearly ignored sexual misconduct and abuse within their own building, they seemed to pump up and abet wild and unsubstantiated allegations of sexual misconduct against people whose politics they don't like. So, for example, I watched you on a panel at NBC when you worked there last year on Kavanaugh. It was the last story I think you covered before you left. It was Savannah Guthrie and Lester Holt and Chuck Todd were all on this panel. You were the only person on the panel who held out the possibility that maybe Brett Kavanaugh was not a rapist. Did you feel like the only person who was capable of being objective on that question?
Well, I mean, there's no question that the reporting that was done at NBC on somebody like, let's take Julie Swetnick, who was the completely discredited alleged third accuser against Kavanaugh. This is the woman whose story had, I mean, tons of holes in it. She was, there was a date rape and everybody saw it and then nobody saw it, and she basically imploded on the air. This is an Avenatti client, remember her?
Yes, vividly.
They went to air with that story with far less trepidation than they showed in going to air on the Harvey Weinstein story, for which they had tapes. They had tapes, they had witnesses, they had women on the record. Rose McGowan was just one of them. And there is a question of why, right? Was it political, as you suggest here? Was it something else? Was it to protect somebody internally, someone who wasn't the women of the company, right? Because here, what Ronan's suggesting is that they covered up for one sexual predator, Harvey Weinstein, in order to protect another, Matt Lauer. They deny all of this, and NBC has put out several statements saying that Ronan is a conspiracy theorist and this is all nonsense and he's got an axe to grind. But if that's true and there's nothing to hide, then get an outside investigator.
Yeah, if there's nothing to hide. Megyn Kelly hasn't been on TV for years. She's got a lot to say. We're happy to have her in our studio tonight. Thanks to Ronan Farrow. In the last week, we've learned a lot about the lengths to which some NBC executives went in order to cover up sexual abuse. The details are so stunning that even some on the left, presumably NBC viewers themselves, have expressed outrage. Earlier today, the feminist group Ultraviolet issued this statement, quote, "The DNC needs to make it clear they support survivors of sexual abuse and cancel the upcoming 2020 Democratic presidential primary debate on MSNBC until Comcast and NBC News take clear steps to clean up the toxic culture that exists across their networks." Megyn Kelly, do you think there's any chance the DNC will act on that?
I do think there's a chance. I do. I mean, I think that if this were Fox News and Fox News were hosting a Democratic debate in conjunction with the Washington Post,
yes,
they'd be putting on the full court press to make sure Fox was out or Fox made some sort of a promise to clean up its act. So I take that seriously, because once, people are not screwing around anymore when it comes to the treatment of women.
Right.
And what used to be tolerated will not be tolerated anymore. And it's not that we have a perfect culture like that when we recognize there's a problem. It's that companies are given the opportunity to sort of come clean, investigate what the problems are, and come up with real solutions. NBC says it's done that. They say you can trust Kim Harris, the internal GC. And Ronan's given us about 400 reasons to doubt that. Right?
Yes.
So it's really up to the public. Are they going to put the pressure on them to do something, to get an outside investigator, or aren't they? So
one of the most amazing, I think, details in the book, maybe not so surprising, is that Hillary Clinton applied pressure to Farrow, he says, not to pursue the Harvey Weinstein story. And so I wonder, and of course I don't know the truth, that's his claim. Why has no one asked Hillary Clinton about this, I wonder?
And maybe eventually they will. I mean, there are a lot of fish to fry there.
Yeah.
And I think Hillary's spokesperson has come out and said it was nothing and it's been misrepresented, right? So they're kind of denying that. But look, more needs to happen in order for us to get to the bottom of this. You've got, NBC says there was no way for them to know any of this, right? Because they didn't know anything until Brooke Nevels came in, and only at that point did a couple more women come forward and say, me too. The truth is that we've seen already. There was Addie Zanone. She came on my show. I had her on my show while I was at NBC. She had a consensual affair with Lauer. She was 24 years old. He plucked her out of being a PA and started an affair with her. Then there was Brooke Nevels, 30 years old, assistant to Meredith Vieira, who, same thing, and, all the multiple ways of, and she says she was raped by him. He's denied that and said it was a consensual affair. There was Melissa Launer, who said he exposed himself to her one night after an NBC party, and that she ultimately went and left the company. There was a woman who claimed she had sex with him in his office, and she fainted. It was so traumatic.
I remember.
There's Ann Curry, says with an open secret. So the question is, if they didn't know, why didn't they know?
Well, they're lying.
Why didn't they?
They're lying, but it doesn't diminish the self-righteousness with which they approach other people's sins, I notice. So I want to ask you, since you worked here at Fox News, you worked at NBC, you got some perspective. I want to ask you about the state of journalism today. And I want to start with a clip from last night's debate. This is Anderson Cooper at CNN asking a question of the former Vice President Joe Biden. Watch this.
The impeachment inquiry is centered on President Trump's attempts to get political dirt from Ukraine on Vice President Biden and his son Hunter. Mr. Vice President, President Trump has falsely accused your son of doing something wrong while serving on a company board in Ukraine. I want to point out there's no evidence of wrongdoing by either one of you.
So what kind of journalist begins a question to a politician by reassuring him that attacks by his opponents are false and he's actually innocent? Is that a question?
So the answer was kind of baked into the question there, right?
It was.
It's clear you did nothing wrong, but did you do anything wrong?
Exactly.
Listen, that wasn't Anderson's best moment. I like Anderson. That wasn't his best moment. I think his question would have been fine if he said, you didn't do anything illegal. No one's alleged you did anything illegal. Because really what the guy did was he sat on a board. Hunter Biden has no expertise in Ukraine. He has no expertise in natural gas. He takes his job sitting on the board of this Ukrainian company for $50,000 a month while his dad is the vice president. And the reason he got that job is presumably his last name is Biden. So they're paying for access. They're paying for, the association. Is that corrupt? You could make a very strong argument that it is. So is it wrong? Well, that's up to the voters to decide. So, maybe he could have reworded that. Maybe he'd like that one back.
But it's and I agree with you, by the way. I know Anderson Cooper fairly well. I don't think he's the worst offender. But this is part of a larger tapestry here, and it adds up to basically partisan interference in an election. I mean, you have journalists who feel that their first obligation is to help a candidate or hurt another candidate.
Yeah.
That's not journalism.
Oh, 100%. And this goes back to right before Trump was elected. Jorge Ramos of Univision came on my show, and we had a very heartfelt discussion about journalism in America, and he made a strong plea for journalists to abandon neutrality. He said, that's over. You've got to come out and you've got to say, Trump's a racist, Trump's a misogynist, Trump's a bigot. So whatever your view is, you've got to say it, you've got to sell it, and that the time for neutrality is past. And I do believe he's persuaded, and others have come to their own conclusion, that that's the way forward. That's why we had a question. There was another CNN debate where Don Lemon specifically said, how do you answer voters who prioritize the economy over Trump's bigotry? Right? So there's a judgment in there.
A judgment?
Yeah. Right. I'm just saying, OK, so fine. Many people may agree with that, but it's the anchor's subjective judgment, and it doesn't belong, in my view, in a debate question. Same way as the New York Times is arguing, the old schoolers with the young folks, about whether the Times should be, quote, part of the resistance.
But I guess the problem that I have with it is not that someone shows an opinion. I've got a million opinions. Is that they're lying about what it is. And they're saying, we're journalists, we're objective. Why can't they drop the pretense and be honest with us and tell us we're partisan combatants? Because they are.
We already know. I mean, that's the real joke, right? It's like we already know. Fox News was founded, 1996, right? They just had their birthday on the premise that the other side of the stories weren't being told, and that half of the country was being ignored, and that if you did fair and balanced news, the people would watch. And there was a premise that the other media, the mainstream media, maybe they weren't far left, right? But that there was a baked-in bias against people who believe in homeschooling, who believe in a pro-life position, who might have a gun, right? And so they made a whole empire based on programming to those people. I think what's happened now on the other half of the country, on sort of the mainstream, is they've embraced it. It was sort of passive, and now it's active. Now it's, let's work. He's too bad. We have to work together.
Right.
We'll be judged. History will judge us as whether we were for or against this man.
Okay, so we were planning to bring you a Dennis Rodman segment, which we had to pre-tape earlier. We're going to save that for tomorrow. This is interesting. If you don't mind staying?
Sure.
We'll be right back. We promised you a conversation with Dennis Rodman on China in this segment. Then we got carried away talking to Megyn Kelly, so we're going to continue that and bring you Dennis Rodman tomorrow. No, and we're happy we did. So I have to ask
Rodman's a great interview.
So you spent all these years in the news business. You've taken a year off. You've been thinking, assessing, probably watching some news, I hope. A little. 2 days ago, this report comes out from Project Veritas on CNN, and in it, whatever you think of their methods, they have the head of CNN, Jeff Zucker, instructing his employees, impeachment, impeachment, impeachment. We're hitting impeachment no matter what. It doesn't matter what you think. Impeachment's the only story that matters. That sounded more like a political campaign to me than a news judgment.
Well, I mean, impeachment is a big story,
For
right?
sure.
If the president of the United States is going to get impeached and possibly bounced out of office, it's a major, major story.
I would say.
So I think that's defensible on the part of Jeff Zucker. But I do think sort of the hyper-focus on it by most of the media at the expense of all else is not new, right? Since the day Trump got into office, they've been hyper-focused on impeachment. And this is one of the problems that the Democrats, and also to some extent the media, is up against. That from the day he took office, it was the 25th Amendment, the Emoluments Clause, Russia, 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 obstruction of justice, all of those things. He has to be impeached. And if everything is an 11, nothing is an 11.
Right.
So now they may have actually stumbled upon an 11, right? They've got the transcript, whatever. Trump says it was a perfect call. You can make an argument. But no one's paying as much attention as they otherwise would have if we hadn't been told from the beginning that he needs to be bounced out of office. So, I don't know. They can ratchet up the coverage all they want. I don't know whether they're convincing anyone who was on the fence or in the middle.
At all. I mean, it seems like people are starting to tune out in general from news coverage because, how long can you keep the fever
because in our outrage culture, right? It's like, what am I supposed to be outraged about again? I'm going to get there. I'm going to get outraged. Just give me 2 seconds, and I'm going to. And then you're like, Ukraine? All right.
But what about, do you remember, we talked about this at the time. At Trump's election, there was, you heard people say, we need to think about who his voters are. There's a whole world out there we in the media know nothing about. Yep. We should be sympathetic to these Trump voters. That lasted for about 15 seconds.
No, you're wrong. They looked and they were like, oh, never mind. I think it was a conscious decision. We don't want to go into that world.
No.
Right? Look at them with their guns and their cowboy hats. No. Right? I just don't think that the mainstream media has any connection to flyover country. And when they meander through Montana, they've never seen such a thing. Like, it's a rodeo, and they talk differently.
But shouldn't they
have different values
to understand the country they cover?
Look, I think they do, right? I think they believe they do. But, I think most people, for example, take a look at the guy in Washington State who wouldn't bake the cake for the gay couple. And they just think bigot.
The media.
Yeah. And the problem is it's so much more complicated than that.
That's for sure.
Right?
So speaking of, I have to ask you, since you've had this very well-covered career.
Yeah.
and you've taken a year to think. What have you learned after all of this, everything that's happened, would you say?
Very little. I don't learn so well. Yeah.
Is that true?
I've learned nothing. I'm like Woody Allen. I'm 48 years old. I've learned nothing. No, I have learned a thing or two. I mean, what comes to mind is the goodness of humanity. You know, how the kindness of strangers. Just as awful as the media can be, actual humans are awesome and loving and kind and helpful. And really, I think about it, Tucker, because I left Fox News in January of 17. And the reason I left is because I wanted to be with my family, right? I was missing my kids' childhood. They were little, like 7, 5, and 3. So I could still see it. I could still be a part of it. And now I'm doing it. You know, I have spent the past year in particular, but even before that, with them. And I'm mothering my own kids. And there's no substitute for that. You know, I lost my dad when I was 15 years old. And so I know on an inherent basis, you don't get a do-over, right?
That's true.
So I'm there and I'm enjoying it, and I'll get back on that horse soon because this has been fun. So I'll probably get it back out there. But right now I'm still enjoying my day-to-day life with my family and friends.
Megyn Kelly, thank you for the conversation.
Thanks for having me, Tucker.